I just destroyed my boss's entire life and sent him to prison for 20 years. And honestly, I should have done it months earlier when I first caught him having sex with his secretary in his office. But what happened next was so much worse than just an affair, and by the time I realized how deep this corruption went, I was already trapped in a web of blackmail that could have ended my career forever. Let me tell you exactly how my trusted mentor became my worst nightmare, and why he's now facing federal charges while I'm sitting in his old corner office. You guys who work in corporate environments are going to understand this immediately. I had been working at Morrison Financial Group for 3 years, and I genuinely loved my job as a senior analyst. The company specialized in investment management for high net worth clients, and I was making decent money while learning from what I thought was one of the most ethical bosses in the industry. David Morrison, the company president, had this reputation for being a family man, a pillar of the community, and someone who genuinely cared about his employees. His wife Sarah was actually my closest friend from college, and she's the one who recommended me for the position when I was struggling to find work after graduation. Sarah Morrison owned 60% of the company through her family trust, while David ran the day-to-day operations. She was incredibly sweet, always asking about my career development, and she made it clear that she saw me as someone with serious potential to move up in the organization. I felt so grateful to have landed in such a supportive environment, especially after hearing horror stories from friends about toxic workplaces and abusive managers. David seemed like the perfect boss during my first 2 years. He mentored me personally, gave me challenging projects, and even hinted that I was being considered for a promotion to senior management. But then everything started changing around month 3 of my 3rd year. I began noticing small things that didn't quite add up. David would have these mysterious meetings with clients that weren't on the official calendar, and sometimes I'd see him handling paperwork that he'd quickly hide when I walked into his office. The atmosphere in the building started feeling different too. Some of the older employees seemed nervous around him, and there were whispers about budget discrepancies that nobody wanted to discuss openly. The first red flag came when I was working late one Thursday evening, trying to finish a quarterly report that was due the next morning. Most of the office had cleared out by 7 p.m., but I needed to access some files from David's computer to complete my analysis. He had given me his password months earlier for situations exactly like this, so I didn't think twice about logging into his system to grab the documents I needed. That's when I noticed something strange in his browser history. There were multiple visits to offshore banking websites, cryptocurrency exchanges, and financial privacy services that had nothing to do with our legitimate business operations. I probably should have walked away right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I started looking deeper into the files on his computer, and what I found made my stomach drop. There were spreadsheets tracking transactions that didn't match any of our official client accounts, and email conversations about moving money through shell companies that I had never heard of. The amounts were staggering. We're talking about millions of dollars being moved around in ways that definitely weren't part of our normal investment strategies. My hands were literally shaking as I printed out some of the most damning documents. I knew I was looking at evidence of some kind of financial fraud, but I couldn't figure out the full scope of what was happening. All I knew was that my respected mentor, the man who had guided my career development and earned my complete trust, was involved in something seriously illegal. The worst part was realizing that some of these suspicious transactions dated back to before I even started working at the company, which meant this corruption had been going on for years while everyone, including his wife, was completely in the dark. I spent the entire weekend agonizing over what to do with this information. David had been nothing but kind to me personally, and Sarah was my best friend. How could I possibly tell her that her husband was stealing from their company? But at the same time, I knew I couldn't just pretend I hadn't seen those documents. Other employees' jobs were at stake, and if this fraud was discovered by regulators, the entire company could collapse. Monday morning came, and I had decided to confront David directly before taking any other action. I thought maybe there was some explanation I was missing, Or perhaps I had misunderstood what I was looking at. I was hoping against hope that my boss, the man I had looked up to professionally, wasn't actually the criminal that the evidence suggested he was. I knocked on his office door around 10 a.m., my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. When he called for me to come in, I walked through that door, expecting to have a difficult but necessary conversation about what I had discovered. Instead, I walked straight into a scene that changed everything forever. David was bent over his desk with his pants around his ankles, and his secretary Michelle was underneath him in a position that left absolutely no doubt about what they were doing. The sound of the door opening made them both freeze, and for about 3 seconds, we all just stared at each other in complete shock. Michelle scrambled to pull her skirt down, while David frantically tried to pull his pants up, both of them red-faced and breathing hard. Now, finding your boss having sex in his office is awkward enough, but it wasn't the affair that bothered me the most. What really got to me was the fact that David was cheating on Sarah, my best friend, the woman who had given me this job opportunity and who trusted her husband completely. Sarah talked about David constantly, about how lucky she felt to be married to such an honest, faithful man, and how proud she was of the business they had built together. David finally managed to get his clothes back in order, and he dismissed Michelle with looks that clearly said they would discuss this later. She practically ran out of the office, leaving me alone with my half-dressed boss, who was now trying to act like nothing unusual had just happened. The audacity of this man to straighten his tie and ask me what I needed to discuss, as if I hadn't just caught him betraying his wife in the most personal way possible. I was so flustered that I completely forgot about the financial documents I had planned to confront him about. Instead, I just stood there stammering something about needing to get back to work, while he nodded and told me to close the door behind me. I walked back to my desk in a complete daze, my mind racing with the implications of what I had just witnessed. The rational part of my brain kept telling me that his personal life wasn't my business, but I couldn't get past the fact that he was deceiving Sarah so completely. She called me that very evening to chat about her anniversary plans, gushing about how much she loved David and how excited she was about the surprise party she was planning for him. Listening to her talk about their perfect marriage while knowing what I knew was absolutely torture. But then I remembered the financial documents, and suddenly the affair seemed like the least of our problems. I realized I was now in possession of evidence that could destroy David's life in multiple ways, and I had no idea how to handle the situation responsibly. If I reported the financial fraud, it would come out during the investigation that I had been snooping through his personal computer files. If I told Sarah about the affair, it would devastate her personally and potentially impact the business that she owned. I decided to keep quiet and observe for a while, hoping that maybe David would come clean on his own, or that the situation would resolve itself somehow. That was probably the biggest mistake I made in this entire ordeal, because David had no intention of changing his behavior. Instead, things got dramatically worse over the next few weeks. The affair with Michelle became increasingly obvious to anyone who was paying attention. They would disappear together for long lunches, exchange meaningful looks during meetings, and I even caught them making out in the supply closet one afternoon. But what bothered me even more was watching David's treatment of the other employees start to deteriorate. He became more demanding, more critical, and more willing to throw people under the bus when things went wrong. I also started noticing that the financial irregularities were getting worse, not better. More suspicious transactions were happening, and David was spending an unusual amount of time on personal calls during business hours. When I walked past his office, I could hear him talking about cryptocurrency investments and offshore accounts in hushed tones that definitely didn't sound like legitimate business conversations. The breaking point came about 3 weeks after I had caught him with Michelle. I was working late again, trying to finish a presentation for a major client meeting, when I heard voices coming from David's office. The door was slightly open, and I could hear him talking to Michelle about something that made my blood run cold. He was explaining to her how they could siphon more money from client accounts, without triggering the automatic fraud detection systems that the company had in place. They were literally planning to steal more money, and Michelle was actively helping him figure out how to do it without getting caught. She wasn't just his mistress. She was his partner in crime, helping him rob the company that employed both of them. I grabbed my phone and started recording their conversation, knowing that I now had proof of their conspiracy to commit fraud. But just as I was getting the most incriminating part of their discussion on tape, my phone started ringing with the loudest ringtone imaginable. I had forgotten to put it on silent mode, and the sound echoed through the quiet office like a fire alarm. Both David and Michelle went completely silent, and I heard footsteps approaching the door. I quickly pretended to be focused on my computer, hoping they would think the sound had come from somewhere else. But David appeared in my cubicle area within seconds, his face dark with suspicion. He asked me how long I had been working late and whether I had heard anything unusual. I tried to play it off casually, telling him I had been focused on my presentation and hadn't noticed anything, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. Michelle appeared behind him, looking nervous and avoiding eye contact with me completely. David suggested that maybe it was time for me to head home, since it was getting late and I looked tired. It wasn't really a suggestion. It was clearly an order disguised as concern for my well-being. I packed up my things and left the office. But I knew that my relationship with David had just shifted dramatically. He suspected that I had overheard their conversation, and I suspected that he was going to do something to protect himself from exposure. Sure enough, the next morning, I arrived at work to find David waiting for me at my desk with a very serious expression on his face. He told me that he needed to speak with me privately in his office, and the tone of his voice made it clear that this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. When we got to his office, he closed the door and activated the white noise machine that he normally used for confidential client calls. Then he turned to me with a look I had never seen before, a combination of desperation and menace that made me realize I was in serious danger. He told me that he knew I had been snooping through his computer files and that he was aware I had overheard his conversation with Michelle the night before. My heart started racing, but I tried to deny everything, hoping that maybe I could convince him he was being paranoid. But then he pulled out a tablet and showed me security camera footage of myself in his office, clearly accessing his computer several weeks earlier. The timestamp proved that I had been there long after business hours, and the angle of the camera made it obvious that I was looking at his screen rather than just using his computer for legitimate work purposes. I felt my face go pale as I realized that he had been monitoring me this entire time, waiting for the right moment to confront me about my unauthorized access to his files. He had known for weeks that I was aware of his financial crimes, and he had been planning his response to my discovery. That's when he made me an offer that I will never forget as long as I live. He told me that he understood why I might be concerned about what I had seen, but that I was misunderstanding the nature of his business activities. According to him, everything I had witnessed was part of a sophisticated investment strategy that was completely legal, just complicated enough that it might look suspicious to someone without advanced financial training. He offered to promote me to vice president of operations, with a salary that would triple my current income, plus a company car and a signing bonus of $50,000. All I had to do was forget what I had seen and promise never to discuss his business activities with anyone else, including his wife. The promotion he was offering was one that I'd been working toward for years, and the salary increase would have changed my life completely. I could pay off my student loans, help my parents with their mortgage, and finally have the financial security that I had been dreaming about since college graduation. But I knew that accepting his offer would make me complicit in his crimes, and that staying silent about his affair would mean betraying Sarah's trust in the worst possible way. I told him that I needed some time to think about his proposal, hoping that I could buy myself enough time to figure out how to handle the situation properly. David's expression hardened, and he told me that this was a one-time offer that needed to be accepted immediately. He made it clear that if I refused his generosity, he would have no choice but to fire me for unauthorized access to confidential company information. He had already prepared a termination letter citing my violation of computer security policies, and he could have me escorted out of the building within the hour. The worst part was when he told me that he would also make sure that I was blacklisted from the financial industry entirely. He had connections throughout the sector, and he could ensure that no reputable firm would ever hire me again. My career in finance would be over before it had really begun, and I would be forced to start over in a completely different field. I felt trapped in a way that I had never experienced before. Either I could accept his offer and become his accomplice, or I could refuse and watch my professional life get destroyed. He had systematically removed all of my options, leaving me with a choice between corruption and career suicide. Looking back now, I realize that this was the moment when David revealed his true nature. The caring mentor who had guided my professional development was actually a sophisticated manipulator who had been grooming me for exactly this situation. He had earned my trust and gratitude specifically so that he could leverage those emotions when he needed my silence. But what he didn't realize was that I had already started building a case against him, and that his attempt to blackmail me into compliance was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I looked David in the eye and told him I would accept his offer. The relief that washed over his face was almost comical, like he genuinely believed that a promotion and some money would be enough to buy my silence about his massive financial fraud and his betrayal of my best friend. He actually smiled and shook my hand, congratulating me on making the smart choice for my career. But what David didn't know was that I had already forwarded copies of those financial documents to my personal email account, and that I had been building a comprehensive file of evidence against him for weeks. His blackmail attempt had just given me the final piece of proof I needed to demonstrate that he was running a criminal enterprise, not just making some questionable business decisions. The promotion came through within 48 hours, along with the salary increase and company car he had promised. Michelle processed all the paperwork with a smug expression that made it clear she thought David had successfully neutralized the threat I represented. They both seemed to believe that I had been bought off, and they went back to their regular routine of stealing money and having sex in the office. For the next 2 weeks, I played the role of the grateful employee who had been rewarded for her loyalty and discretion. I attended management meetings, drove my new car to work, and deposited my significantly larger paychecks without any visible signs of moral conflict. David even started including me in more sensitive business discussions, apparently convinced that I was now part of his inner circle. What he didn't realize was that every conversation we had was being recorded on my phone, and that every document he shared with me was being copied and stored in a secure location. I had also started taking photos of Michelle entering and leaving his office at suspicious times, building a timeline of their affair that would corroborate my other evidence when the time came to expose them. The turning point came when David made the catastrophic mistake of trying to involve me directly in his fraud scheme. During a private meeting in his office, he explained that he needed me to help him move some money through accounts that weren't being monitored by the company's compliance department. According to him, this was just a temporary cash flow issue that required some creative accounting to resolve. He showed me exactly how he had been siphoning money from client accounts, using a sophisticated system of shell companies and cryptocurrency exchanges to hide the transactions from regulators. The amounts were even larger than I had initially realized. We're talking about more than $5 million that had been stolen over the past 3 years. David explained that he needed the money to cover some personal investments that had gone bad, and that he planned to pay everything back once those investments recovered. But I could tell from the way he talked about his financial situation that he was in way deeper than he was admitting, and that the stolen money was never going to be returned to the client accounts where it belonged. The most shocking part was when he told me that Sarah had no idea how bad their personal finances had become. He had been hiding massive debts from her for years, including gambling losses and failed business ventures that had cost them everything. The company that Sarah thought was thriving was actually hemorrhaging money to cover David's personal disasters. When I asked him what would happen if the fraud was discovered, he just shrugged and said that by then, he and Michelle would be living in a country without extradition treaties. They had already been moving money to offshore accounts in preparation for their eventual escape, and they had passports ready under assumed names. That's when I realized that David wasn't just stealing money. He was planning to disappear completely, leaving Sarah to face the legal and financial consequences of his crimes. The company she owned would collapse, the employees who depended on their jobs would be left unemployed, and the clients whose money had been stolen would lose their life savings. I told David that I needed some time to understand the technical aspects of what he was asking me to do, but that I was committed to helping him resolve the situation. He was so relieved to have my cooperation that he gave me full access to all of his financial records, including the offshore accounts and cryptocurrency wallets where the stolen money was being hidden. That night, I called in sick the next day and spent 18 hours organizing all of the evidence I had collected into a comprehensive report that detailed every aspect of David's criminal operation. I had bank records, email conversations, recorded phone calls, photographs, and witness testimony that painted a complete picture of the fraud scheme and the affair that had enabled it. But I knew that going to the police or the SEC wouldn't be enough to protect Sarah from the financial devastation that was coming. David had structured the theft in a way that made the company legally liable for the missing client funds, which meant that Sarah's assets could be seized to cover the losses even though she had no knowledge of the crimes. That's when I decided to call Sarah directly and tell her everything I had discovered. It was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had in my life, explaining to my best friend that her husband was not only cheating on her, but also stealing millions of dollars from the company she owned. Sarah's initial reaction was complete denial. She couldn't believe that David would betray her trust so completely, and she accused me of making up lies because I was jealous of their marriage. But when I started showing her the evidence I had collected, including photos of David and Michelle together, and bank records showing the unauthorized transactions, her denial turned into a rage that was honestly scary to witness. She immediately called an emergency meeting with the company's lawyers and accountants, and by the end of that day, we had a team of forensic investigators going through every financial record in the building. What they found was even worse than what I had discovered on my own. David had been stealing money almost from the day he started working at the company, using increasingly sophisticated methods to hide his crimes as the amounts grew larger. The total theft was closer to $8 million, and some of the missing money belonged to elderly clients who had trusted the company with their retirement savings. When David arrived at work the next morning, he was greeted by federal agents who arrested him on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and securities violations. The look of shock on his face when he realized that his carefully constructed criminal empire had collapsed overnight was honestly the most satisfying moment of my entire career. Michelle was arrested about an hour later at her apartment, where agents found evidence that she had been actively helping David plan their escape to a non-extradition country. They had already booked flights to leave the country the following weekend, apparently convinced that their crimes would never be discovered. The next few weeks were absolutely chaotic as the full scope of the fraud became public knowledge. The story made national news because of the amount of money involved and the sophisticated methods David had used to hide his crimes. Several other financial firms came forward to report that they had received suspicious inquiries from David about moving large amounts of money through their systems. What really amazed me was how quickly the federal investigators were able to trace all of the stolen money once they had access to David's records. The cryptocurrency exchanges and offshore banks that he thought would protect him actually made his crimes easier to track, because every transaction was permanently recorded on digital ledgers that couldn't be erased or modified. Within 6 weeks, the government had recovered more than 90% of the stolen funds, and the clients who had been victimized were able to get their money back. Sarah was able to keep the company operating under new management, and most of the employees were able to keep their jobs throughout the transition. The legal proceedings moved incredibly fast because David's crimes were so well documented. He ended up pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for a 20-year prison sentence, while Michelle received a 10-year sentence for her role in the conspiracy. Both of them were also ordered to pay millions of dollars in restitution and fines, ensuring that they would never be able to profit from their crimes. The most satisfying part came about 3 months after David's arrest, when Sarah offered me his old position as president of the company. She told me that my decision to expose the fraud had saved not only her personal finances, but also the jobs and retirement savings of dozens of innocent people. My new salary was actually higher than what David had been stealing to pay himself, and I got to keep the company car and the signing bonus from his original bribery attempt. But the best part was knowing that I had done the right thing, even when it would have been easier and more profitable to stay silent. Sarah and I are closer friends now than we ever were before, bonded by the experience of surviving David's betrayal together. She started dating again and seems genuinely happy for the first time in years, no longer carrying the stress of being married to a man who was lying to her about everything. The company is more successful now than it ever was under David's leadership, partly because we're no longer losing millions of dollars to theft, but also because our clients trust us more now that they know we take compliance and ethics seriously. Several large investment firms have approached us about partnerships, attracted by our reputation for integrity in an industry that's often seen as corrupt. As for David, he's serving his sentence at a federal prison in Pennsylvania, where I hear he's working in the kitchen for about 20 cents an hour. Michelle is at a women's facility in Ohio, and according to Sarah's private investigator, they're no longer in contact with each other. Apparently, their great love affair wasn't strong enough to survive the reality of prison life. The one thing that still bothers me sometimes is wondering how long David's crimes would have continued if I hadn't accidentally discovered them. He was getting more sophisticated and more brazen with each passing month, and there's no telling how much money he might have stolen or how many people he might have hurt if his operation had continued unchecked. But I also realize that his downfall was inevitable, because people like David always get greedy and make mistakes that expose their crimes. The affair with Michelle was just the beginning of his loss of judgment, and eventually he would have done something stupid enough to attract the attention of regulators or law enforcement. The experience taught me that sometimes the hardest decision is also the right decision, even when it feels like you're risking everything to do what's morally correct. David tried to use my fear and ambition against me, but ultimately his attempt to corrupt me just gave me more evidence to use against him in court. I also learned that loyalty has to be earned through consistent ethical behavior, not just through professional kindness or personal favors. David had been good to me professionally, but that didn't give him the right to expect my silence when he was committing crimes that hurt innocent people. These days, I make sure that our company has multiple layers of oversight and transparency, so that no single person could ever again accumulate the kind of unchecked power that enabled David's crimes. We have external audits, rotating responsibilities, and whistleblower protections that make it easy for employees to report suspicious behavior without fear of retaliation. I also speak at financial industry conferences about the importance of ethical leadership and the warning signs of workplace fraud. It's amazing how many people have similar stories about discovering corruption in their organizations, and how difficult it can be to know how to respond when you're in a position where speaking up could cost you your career. The message I always try to convey is that corruption thrives in environments where good people stay silent because they're afraid of the personal consequences of speaking up. David was able to steal millions of dollars and betray dozens of people because he correctly calculated that most employees would be too scared or too self-interested to expose his crimes. But what he didn't anticipate was that eventually he would target someone who cared more about doing the right thing than about protecting their own career advancement. His downfall came because he underestimated the power of moral courage, and because he forgot that evidence of crimes has a way of surfacing no matter how carefully you think you've hidden it. Looking back now, I realize that catching David having sex with his secretary was actually the least shocking thing about that entire experience. The affair was just a symptom of his fundamental lack of integrity, and it was inevitable that someone who would cheat on his wife would also be willing to steal from his clients and betray his employees. The real lesson is that character matters more than anything else in business, and that short-term profits or career advancement are never worth compromising your ethical standards. David thought he was being smart by prioritizing money over morality, but he ended up losing everything, including his freedom, while the people he tried to victimize ended up stronger and more successful than ever. And honestly, every time I sit in his old office or drive the car he thought would buy my silence, I'm reminded that justice isn't just about punishment for wrongdoing. It's also about making sure that good people are rewarded for their courage, and that organizations become stronger and more ethical after surviving the exposure of corruption. David Morrison thought he could manipulate me into becoming his accomplice, but instead he gave me everything I needed to destroy his criminal empire and build something better in its place. That's a lesson in unintended consequences that I hope he has plenty of time to reflect on during his 20-year prison sentence.